Hi, it's Alexander Russo with The Grade, and I'm delighted to be here today talking to Robert Samuels from the Washington Post about his big new piece about empty desks at DC public middle schools. Robert, thank you so much for being here. For those who might possibly not know who you are, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Robert Samuels. I'm a national enterprise reporter at the Washington Post, which means I tell long form stories about how everyday people are affected by policies, by their governance.
Excellent. Before we jump into the serious business of this very serious story, I like to ask people for their favorite education related song, movie, or TV show. Mine is this middle school season of The Wire from all those years ago. Do you have a movie, TV show, or a song about schools that comes to mind or that you remember liking?
Oh, that's a good question. So I think there are two that immediately come to mind. For movies, I always liked Mr. Holland's Opus.
Okay.
And, I watch it all the time, and I just sort of loved thinking about how education changed over time, and also what it means to be a teacher for a long time. I had a lot of influential teachers growing up. For television show, sadly, unfortunately, uh, Saved by the Bell, I've seen every episode. I know them by heart. Everyone who has sort of, like, met me or watched, any television can pick up me sort of talking about episodes of Saved by the Bell, and oddly, I think as a kid, I watched it so much that I picked up some of the lingo, like, some of the, like, California lingo. So I say "dude" a lot, which is only due to Saved by the Bell.
Right. Oh,
Yeah.
amazing. Okay. That's a great one. I don't think I've heard that one before or in a while.
Oh, that's sad.
And then and then one last question. I like to ask, journalists what they were like in school, and since we're talking about middle school, I wanna ask you a little bit. I had big hair, and I wanted to be a tougher kid than I was in middle school. I was a big scaredy cat in middle school. What were you like in middle school?
Uh, People who know me in middle school often remark that I dress in the same way in middle school that I dress today, which I don't know what that says about me either today or in the past. Uh, but I grew up in the Bronx, and I was in a magnet program, and I was friendly with everyone, but really competitive with myself. I get really upset if I didn't do perfectly on exams. I was known to cry a lot in frustration, um,
Oh.
because I was, like, sort of terrified that if I didn't do well in middle school, my life would be ruined and I'd be on a path to becoming a crackhead. I think if you grew up in New York in the '80s, like, there's always this, like, latent fear that, like, if you do something, you're gonna end up on the street. And so I very much had that when I was in in, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade.
Wow. Amazing. Let's talk for a second about Empty Desks, which I and many other people have admired since it came out. For those people who haven't read it yet, which of course they will do as soon as they're done listening to this interview, what is the basic story of Empty Desks?
So this piece was done with, Lauren Lumpkin, who's a DC Schools reporter, and John Harden, who's one of our brilliant data journalists, and it's a part of a larger series that the Washington Post was doing, thinking about structural issues that, might have factored into or caused the surge in youth crime. Early on, I had wanted to do a piece looking at prevention, and things that happen before student becomes court involved, and everyone kept talking about how many kids were out of school. And so we began to research, we did a count, and I think it was sort of like near 150 interviews and looked at 10 years of city council meetings and, uh, spoke with kids and immersed ourselves in schools when we could to really get a sense of why truancy had surged. And at the beginning, we were told that, uh, truancy became a problem, this huge problem for middle schoolers after the pandemic. But when we did the research, what we had found was that that problem had started long before the pandemic. And even though the district was really devoting money to getting high schoolers in schools, it sort of dropped the ball in trying to figure out what they could do to help middle schools.
What's the response been so far, either from your fellow journalists or readers or from the folks in the story?
Yeah, well, the response has been pretty overwhelming. A lot of people in the city council have spoken about the story and tried to one address some of the issues in the piece, which is affirming, particularly in a fractured media environment. And we've heard a lot from education officials throughout the country about things that they're trying to do to end truancy. And I think we also saw a pretty persistent movement from some of our more conservative readers, and there are those about whether we should really be thinking about the government's involvement or lack of involvement in trying to quell the problem as opposed to parental involvement.
How does you've written about a lot of things and won a lot of awards for your work. How, if at all, was this story different or similar to the other things you've written about?
Yeah, so it's funny. I actually came to the Washington Post as an education reporter.
Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. I covered schools in Maryland for about a year, but I wasn't very good at it, particularly because I have a wandering mind and I didn't like talking to the same people every day. And, I also learned education reporting is really hard. It takes a lot of finessing, particularly in a protective environment like we have here in the district and its environments to be able to get into school and gain that trust. So in some ways it was kind of a full circle moment for me. But I think similarly, the reporting of this started with a question, right? I live in the District of Columbia. I don't fully understand why so many 11 and 12-year-olds are taking up guns. And I also think it would be really hard to have an 11 or 12-year-old articulate in a full way why they chose to resort to violence. And so what I've learned throughout the course of reporting is that when you have a question like that, I think it's easy to blame the victim. Um, but you can also look at some of the structural issues that happen. And when we started to peel back, you know, not just do we think about the district having this truancy crisis, but then you start asking yourself, how long did it last? What did they do to address it? When they tried to address it, did they keep their promise? What are they doing to help these kids who are probably in really uh, unstable home environments, and how do you do it? And also who's doing it well? Who's been able to figure it out?
Right.
And I think, when you started to peel back those layers, you began to see all of these things. So in terms of the reporting on it, it's very similar to the work I'd done previously. I think for me, the stakes were much higher when you're talking about your own community. You want to make sure you really get it right because some of these incidents that were highlighted happened in my neighborhood, down the street from me. So it was really important.
Mm. Yeah, and this is not an easy read in the sense of the audience experience. It's very tough to grasp both the structural and the individual situations that are going on. In terms of getting in the minds of the kid, though, I'm curious about whether you or any of the other people working on the project felt like you were able to get in the mind of that truant 11-year-old. A few years ago, I was talking to people in Atlanta who had a outlet called Canopy, and they did a big series interviewing the water boys, they called them, the kids selling water at intersections, a little older kids, which was fascinating, right? Did you feel like you were able to get into the minds of the kid who, isn't going to school because there aren't services or accountability or anything fun to do?
Yeah, so there are 2 ways of thinking about it. One, the story starts with, the closest living relative of a 14-year-old named Irving Laborde, and Irving, uh, for the good chunk of his life, was a average, if not above average kid. He read well, he loved movies, he played the piano, and suddenly something began to go wrong. Um, and one day his family can't find him and he ends up dead in, a park after being shot and killed. No one has still found the killer. And, for his family, there's this question of what went wrong. What did we do? Could anyone have helped us? Could anyone have helped Irving? Right. And it's really hard for them to be able to get those answers from an administrative sense, right? Irving's not here to tell the story. He's young, his records are sealed. It's hard to get to if he has no living relative. And so there's that part of it. The other part of it was, we talked to different kids at different parts of the process. So, like, when you speak with an 11 or 12-year-old and you'd say, "Why aren't you coming to school?" They'd say, "School's boring," or "I had trouble getting my hair done," or, like, things like that. And, you start to begin to unpeel some of and you start to realize that in 6th grade, or in 5th grade, they got all these trips. And by 7th grade, there was nothing. And so there was nothing to look forward to. You think about people who they're around and whether or not they had gone to middle school and they had seen the value of high school. And
Right.
the other thing that we did was we spoke with a number of people who were older, who are, 18, 19, 20, and we asked I asked, "When did you start feeling like school wasn't worth it?" And all of them inevitably said 6th or 7th or 8th grade. And also, when they spoke about the conditions of their life, they were kind of similar. They talk about struggle inside the home to have enough money for food and feeling like they needed to contribute once, they went through puberty. They talked about not feeling like there were mentorship programs or people inside the community that could help. They talked about how the teachers they had weren't very encouraging, and so you go to school and there'd be nothing exciting. There wouldn't be coding or robotics. There wouldn't be jazz or debate. And, um, when you hear all of those things, I think the cynic's mind would say like, "Oh, this guy's just giving excuses." But the truth of the matter is that I think it doesn't take that much for a child to be engaged and feel interested if there are people around who did that. And, what the reporting showed was that every step when the district could have intervened, they chose not to or thought it was too difficult.
Right. Part of the, fascinating thing that the piece, got to for me, was that it got to both the accountability side. Is anyone paying attention? Is anyone following up? Those kinds of issues. And then it also got to the programming side, the sort of after-school programs per school. That was new to me, actually, this attempt to quantify anecdotally or systematically, I'm not sure, the number of after school programs for kids across middle schools. Um, was that a hard thing to get? Was that out there and readily available and I just hadn't seen it before?
Yeah, it was hard. Lauren and John and I tried a lot of different things to be able to figure it out. And um the first thing we learned was that the district doesn't keep very good records on this stuff. That they don't have good records on who participates by grade. They don't have a good sense of the needs of students. They're not doing assessments to figure out what kids need. And at the same time, the Mayor Bowser, he declares that every school needs an after school program. Every kid needs a spot. Not saying that she's reliant on surveys from other organizations about the lack of spots because the district doesn't have that information. I'm not saying that even though she said that, she had cut the budget for after school programs by $1,000,000. And so, um, then we began thinking about the buckets of ways that a nonprofit can get in. We pulled a bunch of 990 forms over the course of, uh, I think 15 years to be able to see where the district said it was giving money to nonprofits to head to schools. Um, the district released data about enrollment, that was general and then denied that its own data was accurate.
I saw that.
Yeah, and then, we simply asked if the clubs listed on the school's website were accurate, and they said they didn't know. To, DC Public Schools' credit, they, compiled a list for us, and then you saw it, and it was as clear as day that you saw in a school like Allensdale Middle School, which is kind of seen as the prized middle school in the DC public school, and, you saw 41 programs, but it wasn't just, like, the fact that they had 41 because it's a big school. There are type of programs they had. There was a Harry Potter club, there was a Scrabble club, there was clubs for nail polish and podcasting and archery, and, when you went to the poorer schools, they had a handful, 7 or 8 or 9, and that was, basketball and cheerleading and football, and that's really it. And, when we asked, it was clear that no one was really monitoring those things, but there were promises that they would. In fact, the chancellor had in 2023, we found out that over 5 years, he promised that he'd have programming he wanted programming for every middle schooler, by 2028. It's 2026, 2025, about the halfway mark, and he couldn't even tell us if he'd had added a single program, and I think that, um, helps to illustrate the dedication that the district has put toward this issue.
Tell me a little bit about how the story, your story, is fits in with the other stories, and then I want to ask you a little bit about metro coverage versus feature investigative coverage. Your story, if I understand correctly, is part of a larger package.
Yeah.
How did you divide it up? How is it divided up, and what are a couple of the other pieces?
Yeah, so, the stories attempt to understand why so many kids are committing crime, and why serious crimes, not just, you know, not just, I don't know what a crime in youthful indiscretion would be, but it's definitely not hijacking, and it's definitely not carjacking, and it's definitely not murder. And we saw those numbers rise pretty extraordinarily, during the pandemic. Um, and from there, we began to kind of think about different institutions and different paths along the way. So we started thinking about one, what happens when a person is convicted or pleads guilty to a crime? Are there social resources that allow them to become a better person and to lead a more fulfilling life? And so that was one story looking at the nature of child detention in the district. And we found out that uh, DC is keeping these young people in a detention center for 5 times longer than it used to, that it takes forever to get them services, that the services are often shipped out to different states. Um, and some of the places where these kids are shipped out to are dealing with issues like sexual abuse of those people. And that's at the very end of it. And so we also sort of looked at the dooring. Um, and we looked at another one of my colleagues examined the increased use of ankle monitors, GPS monitors. So as opposed to locking a kid up, they can live in their community so long as they can be tracked. What we found was the district largely gave them the tracking device, but then didn't do any of the tracking.
Right.
And so these kids were going out, continuing to commit crimes or getting killed, um,
With their
and
monitors on.
with their monitors on. So, one of the stunning things that our my colleague Amy Britton found was that last year in 6 weeks, 5 children who had ankle monitors on were killed, and no one knew where they were. Um, and then our story sort of deals with the preventative aspect of it. And so before a kid gets court involved, what things is the district doing to help at-risk youth? And I think the first involvement um, is school system. So that's why we started there. The other thing that I thought was really great, Alex, was we also spoke to kids themselves, and there's this gorgeous, um, but heartbreaking package of kids talking about what it's like to grow up in this kind of environment and the rawness and the honesty that they displayed in those parts being named on camera. It was really remarkable. I think it really helped to show just how much the city is losing its children and how much children are losing because of the city's inability to follow through on the promises that they had for these kids.
Yeah, that was a great part. I'm gonna make sure to, include a link to that, in the show notes. One of the things that came up for me reading the story had to do with, the Post's own coverage of DCPS, and I was curious if you wanted to, reflect a little bit on that. I'm sure at some point in the process, you or someone else went back and looked at whether the Post had been, tracking this issue, and I'm curious what you found. And for me, the issue of the Post coverage of DCPS has been a ongoing source of fascination and concern.
Mhm.
Maybe 10 years ago now, there was a grad rate scandal that seemed to have emerged sort of under the noses of uh, of the Post and other outlets that are in town and charged with uh, uh, tracking these important issues. N and at the time, what I the best that I was able to find out at the time, and this is long ago history at this point, but part of the issue was that, people were getting moved in and out of the DCPS education post, very quickly, moved up to national or moved to Fairfax or moved to, another place. There was a high level of, turnover, and also that the post was, functioning was stronger on the federal and the national education issues. Um, did you have a chance to look back, and see whether the Post had been keeping its promise, for lack of a better word, to its readers to track, vulnerable kids at a difficult time of life?
Yeah, I think, this is a question whenever there is a investigation of a local issue. Like it's like, would you have needed to do the investigation if you were doing continuous daily beat reporting? And I think it's a really valid question. I think there are two things. I think um, Lauren Lumpkin, the schools reporter, um, who worked on this piece, is extraordinary and really does her best to keep on track now. Um, and I do think the Post's mission to become a more national paper has, often sort of obscured the importance of having good, dedicated local coverage. I don't think anyone can reasonably dispute that. However, I do think it's, important to note that local readers still clamor for it. I think one of the things that we were all excited about was seeing how many people were interested in this issue, not just in the district, but across the country. And I'd hope that it would help remind um, those in management about the importance of doing local investigations. Um, I've been involved with the Post first as an intern in 2006, then I came back to cover education in 2011. And, it's been a while since you've seen the posts dedicate so much might and resources to a local issue, and I'm glad that people are reading it because I think it sends the message that, we still care about our home. And I think the other thing is that, even though I'm not tied to the local desk, DC is my home. And I, you know, I it's gonna be the place where, my kids will go to school. It's gonna be the place where I spend my taxes. And um I do think it's sort of an abdication of responsibility that as more people who are reporters live in the district, if we don't ask questions about what life is like in the district. So I'm really pleased at the direction that the reporting is headed in that sense.
It really is quite notable, isn't it?
Yeah.
The one of the things that journalists of all kinds struggle with is how much time and attention to give to what I'm going to call political or culture wars issues. Um, did you make a conscious decision to include or uh, minimize issues about restorative justice and disparate discipline, expulsion variations, and some of the other political issues that often come up around schools,
Ye
or were they just not really a part of the story?
well, you know, we go where the reporting goes. So, when you start having these conversations about uh what's going on in the district and what can be done to prevent broad swaths of youth, that's where the reporting led us to this story. There like I had no sort of presumption going in about what we're going to find or what would congeal. I think what the big question, right, is, do institutions keep their promise? Right? To me, that's the big question. And if not, why not? What became clear to us was that 15 years ago, after there were shootings in DC, which all involved young people, they had said that we're going to tackle this issue. And they never deviated from that plan or protocol. But what the reporting showed was when that protocol started to be abandoned by the district's own staff,
Right.
its leadership didn't do anything about it. They kept going, even though, the reporting showed that the child welfare department was rejecting more than 90% of referrals of neglect that came from the school system, right? And that's a big abdication of responsibility. And so when I thought about it, it sort of became clear that I think if you're really attuned to education issues, you might kind of know this. But I think for those who don't, I think it's sort of a clear indicator of something of a systemic flaw, of an institutional flaw. And I'm less interested in sort of like thinking about stories that try to pathologize what's wrong with today's youth from inside. It's never been easy to be 11 or 12 or 13. So when I thought about what to do, that's the sort of thing that became clear. So in terms of thinking about expulsions or restorative issues, um, they did come up, but it sort of felt like they were kind of better handled one through kind of daily reporting where, there are studies and research and a lot of that stuff is strong and out there. And also thinking about what happens after a kid gets court involved.
And what you found, for as anyone who reads the story will know, is that some of some of the issues that come up have to do with the reporting burden and the bureaucratic the process through which if you ask people to report everything, it can have counterintuitive effects, because sometimes people just can't deal with and sort of shut down. I thought that the psychology of I thought that you got into the psychology of bureaucracy in a really interesting and important way because um, bureaucracies are made up of people, and if you give them too much to do or set an impossible standard for them, they'll do what any human being will do, a kid, adults, or anyone else, which is that they will adapt to make things tolerable for themselves. I thought that was a fascinating systemic angle that you got to.
Yeah, um, it's just sort of what happened. Um, and through reporting, it became clear to us that the questions we were asking weren't really being asked by the people who should be asking them. And if they were, there was kind of an admiration of the problem, like, "Oh, yeah, this is bad, but, we're just trying to do our best." And I think, um, people in government have to make hard decisions every day, and that's completely true. Um, and I wouldn't want people to think that, people in government don't do anything. I'm not sure that's completely true. But what became clear was that the district made choices, and the choice they made was to, uh, deprioritize this issue and then pick it back up when people asked about it, and then put it back down when people moved on.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think that's kind of that's what the reporting showed.
Yeah.
And I think it's particularly damning when, um, it happens with any community's most precious, vulnerable people.
Right.
And in this case, it's students.
My last question. Thank you so much for doing this. My last question has to do with heroes or potential heroes. The piece is full of victims and survivors, and a few people who I might characterize as villains. You might not use that language, but people who didn't do what they promised to do or didn't do as much as they could have. Um, are there in the story or out in the world, because people need to know that there's hope, or are there people in DCPS or people in other districts that have done better at this or made progress against this difficult problem and help kids come to school and stay safe and make it to high school?
I think, this as uh, a person interested in education journalism, but what became clear to me was, uh, that it's true that what matters most is to have engaged people in a kid's life. And the folks who really stood out in the story to me were those who got up every day and tried to make lives better for their students. The two examples that we use in the story are a human services worker, social worker who's embedded in Kramer Middle School, which had the highest truancy rate. And not only did I see the love and love that she poured upon her students, um, but just how observant she was. I followed her into a attendance meeting and we are talking about kids, and she goes, "Have you guys noticed that when his hair is a mess, he's a mess?"
Mm,
Um, and, just kind of, like, having those, like, subtle observations.
mm.
Robert came in and he was smiling 4 days of the week, and on the 5th day, he wasn't smiling. What's up with that? To have that sort of intensity, um, I think it's one of the successes of the district and how much they've been able to reduce the rate. When they did what they said they were going to do, there were results. The other thing that um I was just really struck by was, the testimony of a soccer team at Brooklyn Middle School, uh, which, uh, the team they were out playing soccer, and, the coach is told to keep his kids inside because another young person had been shot at a local metro station. And I think that's hard for everyone, that's hard for a teacher, that's hard for its kids, but because they trusted the teacher and because he had taught them how to deal with hardship, this moment of tragedy became a moment of resolve for his students, and I thought it was really important to highlight, right, that when people say that the theories of this stuff, are pretty simple, um, have an adult who's deeply invested in the lives of a kid, um, and that will bear fruit, having that said is one thing, but actually seeing it and sort of, like, seeing, uh, that coach walk through those halls and all the kids who wanna hug him and
Mm.
tell him everything, I think it really showed the power of education. Yeah.
It's you don't need me to say this, but I'm gonna say it anyway. It's a beautiful, heartbreaking story that you and your colleagues produced. Thank you so much for doing it, and thank you so much for coming on and talking to me and the people who watched the grade, about how you came to it and what you found.
Thank
Much
you so much,
appreciated.
I appreciate it. Take care.
Okay.